Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Aboriginal land. Some of you may have heard me talking a little bit about this yesterday, but I've been spending a lot of time in the Kimberley and in Perth with First Nations matriarchs, and I've been thinking pretty hard about what does that mean when we say unceded land. And just in the context of historical amnesia and actually some of the conversations I've been having with Debra Dank this morning, what it means is that in fact this land was stolen, the land we're on right now, but the entire country. There's a fascinating piece that I would urge you all to go and have a look at if you haven't already. It's published on the Guardian website and it is called The Killing Times. It's mostly research from Newcastle University, and it lists 415 massacre sites where at least 6 First Nations people were killed. So please, when you hear that phrase, unceded Aboriginal land, understand in your bones what that means. One of the Indigenous elders I've been spending time with is a Noongar woman called Charlamina Maya, and she said to me, you cannot know yourself until you know your history. And that's what we're talking about today. What does it mean? This is about historical amnesia, and as Australia, we're really still reckoning with the stories that we tell, those people that we include and those people that we leave out. We're going to have an unflinching look at histories, identities, silences, and the way that these facets of our lives shape our national consciousness. So, with me on stage, Debra Dank. Debra is a I was practicing in the green room. Debra is a Gunditjmara, Wakaija and Kalkadoon woman from the Northern Territory, and this is her book, Terraglossia. It's fantastic. It's just come out. It's for sale out there afterwards. It's a work that challenges linguistic colonisation and speaks to the enduring power of First Nations languages and stories and the way that English colonises First Nations people and their stories. Steve Vizard examines the construction of national myth-making. This is his book here. Nation, Memory and Myth. And it's focusing on Gallipoli and how memory is shaped for collective identity. And my friend Clare Wright here, acclaimed historian, she's exploring the role in this book here, the Bark Petitions, or Naku Dharuk, she's highlighting how Indigenous voices have always sought to influence the course of Australian democracy, even when they have been written out of it. So we're going to be thinking about who gets to author the national story, what happens when we forget or choose to forget, and what does truth-telling really require of us. If you've got questions, write them down. We'll have some time at the end. Debra, I would actually like to start with you because this word, Terraglossia, on the front of your book, you more or less invented it. What does it mean and why did you invent it?
Thank you. Thank you, Ginger. I'm Gunditjmara, Wakaija and Kalkadoon, by the way. But my name is Priyanjalanga, but Debra works too. Terraglossia is a word I did indeed invent. After 40 years of working in education, I decided it was time to stop trying to mould myself into something that I was not. The context wasn't working. I had 5 university degrees at that stage. This was before I did my PhD. And I was still not ever considered to be good enough. And I thought, Aboriginal Australian languages have at least a 13,000-year history in this country, the contemporary languages. Steno-Australian English, we know how long Steno-Australian English has operated in this country, but as a language, it kind of started evolving at the time that Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. And so, while all languages are amazingly valuable, we have to understand that they grow for and with a community. And the words that I was hearing and utilising within my practice as a schoolie, they weren't cutting it for Aboriginal kids. And the idea of terra nullius, and one of my privileges was that I went to university in the very first instance with one Mr. Koiki Mabo. And so I got to look at that process in a very real way. I did some of his assignments for him because he was busy doing much more important work. So the idea of terra nullius, there are so many culturally derived assumptions in that, and there are so many things that are excluded. So Terraglossia, I thought, if I use an Aboriginal word, and I could have used words from my language, I'm going to give my fellow Australians the opportunity to say, no, that's an Aboriginal thing. And I still hear that. That's an Aboriginal problem. That's an Aboriginal thing. I have no business. So I went with Latin. My Latin's not brilliant, but my mother was a brilliant Latin speaker, Aboriginal woman. And Terraglossia is the voice of the earth. That's all it is. But it is a concept that exists absolutely, utterly and totally within Aboriginal Australian cultural framings. So we need to create a new language that is inclusive of all of us, not just assume that one language is going to be enough.
Within your book, English is almost a prison for Aboriginal speakers, people trying to speak their own language, but it also cuts off the culture.
It does. It does. And we end up with really genuinely crazy things. My dad spoke 3 languages, but because standard Australian English was not one of those languages, he was considered to be illiterate. My elders, I'm from the Gulf country in the Northern Territory, my elders speak 5 or 6 languages. They are not ever considered to be polyglots. They're illiterate. How does that work? You know, I have heard non-Aboriginal Australians describe those same people as speaking that jibber-jabber. That's what it is, jibber-jabber. And I think, how do we do that? How? So it's English is a binary language. We know this. Right, wrong, good, bad, rich, poor, man, woman, black, white. My language has always had at least 4 genders. You know, it's been evolving for thousands of years.
And there'd be a lot of Australians that wouldn't speak one word of any of our Indigenous languages. Claire, your book actually uses a lot of language, and you've got whole passages in language. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Ginger, and also want to pay my respects to Darkinjung people and acknowledge that this country and with sovereignty was never ceded, and we can talk a bit more about what sovereignty actually means too. Also, just playing mum for a minute, there's lots of chairs down the front if the people who are standing at the back want to come and sit down and not have to stand up through this fascinating conversation. Ginger, I guess one of the places to start there, actually I could also say that Naraku Yongo Yaku is Goimalulu. My Yongo name is Goimalulu. That name was given to me by a man whose family I was adopted into when I first went to Northeast Arnhem Land 15 years ago. That man, I had permission to use his name, although he passed away a couple of years ago, but family's given me permission to use his name in publicly talking about the book, and that was Gallaroi Nipingu. And Gallaroi gave me the name Goimalulu, which means special tree. And it was one day when I was already into the project of writing this history of the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, a project that Gallaroi had very much encouraged me to do once he figured out that I was an historian. He actually asked me one day when we were at a funeral, he said, "What do you do?" And this is about 5 years after I'd been going up there. And what he meant was, what do you do apart from drive my kids to the pool and do the shopping and cook my dinner and clean the house and make me cups of tea. And I said, Due, that's my kinship term for him, Due, I'm an historian. And he said, oh, you tell stories. I tell stories too. And that was when he wanted to start telling stories together, and that was the beginning of this book. But it was about 5 years into that process when I was sitting with him in the car one day, driving him to his second wife's funeral. And I said, Due, na yongo yaku for Bark Petitions. What's the yongo word for Bark Petitions? And he looked at me, and I thought, oh God, here I've gone again, being a stupid white woman asking stupid questions. But then I realised it was a question he'd never been asked before. And he gave me the name, Naku Dharuk. Naku is the name for the bark that the petitions were painted onto, the painted frames on the petition. And Dharuk is the vocabulary word for the word or the message. It's something, Dharuk can also be a meeting, and what comes out of a meeting, a form of collective decision-making in that meeting, is the Dharuk. So it was a word that combined exactly what those bark petitions were, an innovative form of treating with an Australian government through the parliamentary form of a petition, but doing it through a traditional form, which was the bark painting, but then writing and using colonial literacy in two languages, English and Yongomata, which had only been a written language for about 10 years. One of the Methodist missionaries up there in Millingimbi, Beulah Low, had translated Yongomata into a script. And it was the first petition put to a parliament in an Australian language. And that day was a revelation for me, getting the Yolngu words, because what I realised for the first time was that the bark petitions weren't petitions at all, that it was the paucity of the English language that had confined us to understanding this act of the Yolngu people in 1963, which was a protest about the incursion of mining interests on their land, and the Menzies government having secretly given mining licences to a French bauxite company. Coming onto Yolngu land without consultation or consent and without any form of compensation offered, which broke Yolngu law that had been respected for centuries by Macassan traders, by other strangers. Napaki is a Yolngu word for strangers or outsiders. Others had respected and engaged in international trade relations with Yolngu people. But here, for the first time, Yolngu people understood that their sovereignty was in question. In 1963 was the first time they considered their sovereignty in question. And through these what we would call a petition, which we understand as being something that a conquered people, a subservient people, a submissive people beg up to a higher power through a hierarchical power structure. That's not the governance structure that the Yolngu people were understanding. They were treating across from sovereign nation to sovereign nation. And that penny didn't drop for me until I got the language. So I completely agree with you, Deborah. We can't understand the history of this country and the relationships that have happened within it unless we embrace language.
And the confines of language are so interesting and stifled communication. I want to bring you in here, Steve, because you're really attacking our understanding of Gallipoli and our understanding of Anzac. And when we talk about almost suffocated communication, that's what came to me from your book. I want to read this quote. You said, "Never has Anzac tradition been more popular, and yet never have its defenders been more chauvinistic, bellicose, intolerant of other people's viewpoints." So what does that tell us about the communication of Gallipoli and Anzac?
First, can I just say what a pleasure it is to be here and delight. And also, I might not get a chance to say it, I've read both Debra and Claire's books, and if you haven't got them, go and get them after this. They're absolutely beautiful. Debra's is just poetic, and Claire's is a stunning piece of writing and research, so I just urge you to go and get those two books. I was interested in the power of myths in a community, in a society, because all of the historians tell us and rightly so, that Gallipoli is a failed campaign, a tiny little thing. It wouldn't have changed the war by one day had we even succeeded and got to Istanbul. It was a failure in every sense, socially, military. It cost Australian lives significantly. So why would this tiny little campaign, of all the things that have happened in Australian history, be of such significance to a society? I was trying to reconcile those two bits. What's the power of a myth in a society, and what's the power of other forms of narrative, including history, memory, forgetting, because forgetting is important as well, and every other sort of discourse. So the purpose of my book was really to try and suggest and interrogate, because I had no particular view about this, I just wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand, why is it that nations have myths about things that might relate to an event in the past that have such a hold over that society? And it's a different sort of narrative, it's a different sort of memory, it's a different sort of history and truth-telling than the truth that we get in history. And so as I looked into this, I was trying to, and my book's about how nations search and are held together, as are all communities, but I was looking at nations, by powerful stories that are sacred stories, the sole purpose of which is to bind a society together. And those stories are often false. They're based on untruths.
But often by exclusion, like what Debra and Claire are talking about, like the Anzac myth is, you can't veer off the course. You know, in 2017, Yasmin Abdul-Magid, I'm sure you'd remember this, she was tweeting about Anzac Day, and she was talking about Manus Island and Nauru and the way we treat asylum seekers, and she said, lest we forget, and my God, she ended up having to leave the country because she had tried to challenge this supposedly sacred myth in what is actually quite a reasonable way, I think. I mean, why the kind of trap?
But you've hit it on the head, and that's what I was trying to understand. Precisely what you're talking about it. What is the sacred power of a myth in a society? And every nation has them. The US has got them, Independence Day, Thanksgiving Day, the French have got them, Bastille Day, storming of Bastille, Joan of Arc. We could go through every nation in the world, they've got stories. And if I could just give you 1 second on why I think I go through several factors that every myth has, but they're all based on an historical event. And then what happens is that historical event is appropriated. It's twisted, it's taken. It's an anchor event, but it's turned into a narrative form because narrative forms have power. And at that point, in the shift from the historical event to the narrative form, the dependence on truth evaporates. It's now got another purpose. But there's another significant feature of all national myths, and this is a difficult one. All national myths in every country are founded on a deep trauma of a society at that time. And it's the trauma that gives rise to the grassroots power of the myth. In every society, they arise out of a near extinction event. And for Australia, that power was the trauma of the First World War. And just really quickly, of the 4 million population, 400,000 people enlisted, and of those, 65,000 men were killed, mainly men. Another 150,000 were injured. So out of the 400,000 that enlisted, 230,000 were either killed or injured, of 4 million people at home. And the trauma wasn't just the loss of those people. The real trauma was the suffering of the people here in Australia back home, the women, the families, the wives. And here's the critical fact. Of all of those people, not one, but one body was ever repatriated of the 65,000 killed back here. So what a myth does, it's a form of grieving and processing trauma. So we can contest all sorts of things about whether the myth's valid or what it stands for, but to understand why it works at all and why it has a power at all, it was a form of processing deep trauma for the nation at that time.
Claire,
I'm wanting to say there that I think that you're dead right, Steve. But I think one of the things is that trauma seems to be a zero-sum game. So it only allows for one foundational trauma. Whereas what we know is in Australia there is a preceding trauma, which was the invasion and dispossession of the First Peoples. And that is something that is not, that it's not just, what's her name? Yasmin. This happened to me last weekend. I got absolutely pilloried by the Australian for saying at the Sydney Writers' Festival last week on stage with Thomas Mayo, and Thomas was saying that we have a cult of forgetfulness in Australia. And I said we have a cult of selective forgetfulness because we're told once a year on Anzac Day, lest we forget. We are being actually instructed not to forget.
You might say, lest we remember.
Exactly. And the Australian had a field day with me suggesting that because I was saying the frontier wars are not adequately remembered, that I was in some way trying to trash the Anzac myth. But they can coexist, I do believe.
And Debra and I had this conversation before we came up here, and I was saying, is it amnesia or is it willful forgetting?
Yeah, I see, look, even before the myth that Claire spoke, or the trauma that Claire mentioned, and before Steve's identified trauma, there was another trauma that I think is at the base of this. Our collective Australian nation was built on people being kicked out and rejected from their own country. So what happens in that instance? People arrive here and they try so jolly well hard to claim the place and the space, and nobody, see, Grandma, nobody but nobody gets to tell an Australian otherwise, because this is Australia. And if you don't like it, go back to where you come from. We hear that constantly. But, you know, this kind of, I do not think that it's an amnesia, because I don't, it seems to me that an amnesia is something that was there to be forgotten.
You get donked on the head, also that it's it's passive. You get donked on the head and then it's all wiped.
We've not ever admitted, you know, there was a time a few years ago that it kind of became a little bit cool and a bit sexy to identify the convict heritage. But then it's kind of gone again. It doesn't quite fit whatever this new narrative is. So it can't be amnesia because we were not actually there, and we forget that this is stolen country.
And amnesia conjures up an accident, right?
Yeah.
This isn't accidental.
It is, and see, this is why we have to really critique the English language, because our vocabulary set does not express all of the things that exist underneath. You know, we all know about this iceberg, you know, and we know about this part of the iceberg, but all of this down here, we do not yet, and we have not made peace with our collective history because we are so fragile about admitting it. The last massacre that impacted my grandmother was just on 100 years ago. You know, David Ma this morning was up here talking about his ancestors. His ancestor impacted and had a lot to do with another massacre of my mob, you know. But how do we talk about that? Because his ancestors, let's not forget that, and I'm not condoning, but they arrived here carrying a lot of trauma. So we're all kind of playing silly buggers and lying to ourselves, let alone each other.
No, great point. And Claire, this goes to the Bark Petitions. I was fascinated, you were talking about how they're just in this case in Parliament House, which I've walked past myself, and we didn't really know what they were. So is that part of the great forgetting as well, that we haven't even reconciled with what these, they've almost been fetishised?
Yeah, they've been seen as sort of ethnographic objects rather than political documents, and this is one of the reasons that I've included them in this trilogy. This is the third instalment of my democracy trilogy that started with The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, which is about the Eureka, the women's role in the Eureka flag, something else, a whole gender that was left out of national myth-making and storytelling. The idea that the birth of Australian democracy started at Eureka, but somehow this birth, the only people who were present at the birth were men. And then followed up with You Daughters of Freedom that turned on the women's suffrage banner. So Eureka flag, women's suffrage banner, federation. Again, we know we've got our forefathers, that they were the ones that wrote the Constitution, and they've all got beards, and as if there were no women who were also involved in that, what was actually the birth of the nation. Gallipoli was not the birth of the nation, as Steve's saying. It performed an incredibly important myth-making and psychological and, in a sense, really archetypal function that it played in establishing a particular kind of nation. But the birth of the nation actually happened with the legislation that empowered the Commonwealth of Australia with federation. And then the first sets of laws, and one of those things was that women were the first in Australia, white women, to win full political equality. But Aboriginal women and men were excluded from that idea of who our nation was going to be and who was going to include. So this democracy trilogy is about the idea that democracy, if democracy at its heart is government for the people, by the people, who are those people? Who's included? Who gets to have a sense of belonging in that nation? And these three material objects tell that story. Now, people have walked past, politicians have walked past 2 out of the 4 Bark Petitions that are in Parliament. One of the things my research uncovered was that there were 4. The third one is at the National Museum, where I am the chair. Please go and have a look at that one as well. And the 4th one I managed to locate over the course of my research. It was with a woman in Derby, and we've now repatriated that back to Yirrkala. It's on country there, so if you ever happen to be at the Bukulange Art Centre in Yirrkala, you'll be able to see that. But they were, as you say, Ginger, almost fetishised, because nobody really knew how to... Are they artworks? Are they objects? Are they ethnographic? Because they're kind of pretty and they have these pictures around them. But really what they are, I would argue, is founding documents in Australian democracy, because they are part of this story of who we are and how we came to understand ourselves as a people. Who gets a voice? That's exactly what the Yolngu people were asking for. They were asking to be consulted before people came on their land. They weren't saying you need to stop mining. That's not what they were about at all. They were asking to be consulted and therefore to have Yolngu law upheld. Yolngu people, the different Yolngu Baparu or tribes, clans in the area, had to ask each other for permission to go onto each other's land. If people from Debra's country wanted to go and trade with people from Yolngu people, they would have understood the protocols and the laws for asking the right people, the Junkawa, whether they could come on the land and what they could take from it and what they would give in return. So this is not an artwork.
But there's no explanation even there.
No, and we're working on that now. I actually just was with the people in Parliamentary Services at Parliament House last week. They have actually changed the text now, subsequent to the publication of my book. So they've got new text that's there in the actual display. And we're working collaboratively now on a QR code that when you go and you hit on the QR code in Parliament House, it will take you to a whole website that we're going to populate with voices of the Yolngu people, with a Yolngu woman, my Due, Dila Yunupingu, reading the Yolngu part of the petition in Yolngu Mata, so you can hear it from the Yolngu point of view with photographs from the area and contextualise the whole story to understand this is part of our political history. You know, people have said to me before, and they say this in a very disparaging way, you write women's history, like that's a kind of, it's a ghetto, it's a niche group, and it's only going to be of interest to other people who have the same genitalia as me. But I've always said, no, I don't. I write Australian political history with the women put back in. And I would say the same for this book. This is Australian political history with First Nations people put back in as primary characters.
And thank you, Claire. Steve, just bouncing off what both Claire and Debra have said, you talk about disentangling myth from memory. And what I wonder is, given the stories we're hearing, how we can hold on to something like Gallipoli, which has historical importance, and then make the space for these other foundational narratives. Because there's so little room. It feels almost suffocating reading your book.
I'd slightly disagree. I think we don't need to make the space. We've got the space. There's 364 other days in the year. Yeah. We're a big country. We're a wise people. One of my points in the book is to observe how Gallipoli works, not just to understand why Gallipoli works, so we can understand what might be the preconditions to best nurture other myths. That's what I was interested in. What is it about Gallipoli and Anzac as a sacred story that makes it stick over 100 years plus? And in other countries, what are the preconditions that allow those sorts of stories to flourish? And if we could work that out, maybe we could better plant and seed and nurture these other stories if we know what the conditions are. That was my...
Bucket loads of federal funding.
Well, that is
dogma as well.
That is part of it, but it's not just federal funding, because funnily enough, the federal government, for example, has spent at least 30 times on unsuccessful referenda in Australian history, more on each of those than it does on what it did on the centenary year. But it is absolutely necessary that a myth be perpetuated by the government and by social actors of institutional importance, like education, like the postal department on stamps, but also not just governments, by every significant social agent, those that are attached to government. In Australia, the most powerful one, I think, other than government, one that elects to invest in these things, is sport. You think of the power of sport to get across, for example, just on Gallipoli and Anzac, the power of that message every year, year in, year out. It's watched by more people. It's not just in person, on telly, in the lead-up, in the ads, in the build-up. It's all those other institutions that carry the power of it. So my question simply was, what is it about these stories that require, that permit such investment by agencies, by all sorts of people, to allow them to continue to flourish? One of the requirements, and so just to finish your question, I don't see it as a binary proposition. We get rid of Anzac Day to enable something to flourish. These things are such rare beasts. A myth is a rare beast. You put all of the circumstances together.
To be fair, I didn't say that. I said, well, how do we make room
I'm just
for the
making
other...
a general proposition. There's such a rare beast, kind of a cultural leviathan, that the best way, I think, to allow others to grow is to keep that rare beast in place. We need myths. Every society needs myths. Two things. One, learn from that about what we need to do to get other myths to grow. And two, and Claire's been doing this, harness the power of that existing myth and employ it both to widen out so that existing myth becomes wider, use its power to become wider, and use its power to leverage new stories as well. So I think personally that is the way of the future. We need binding stories. Let's leverage that existing story to get new stories and to grow new stories. So that's kind of that's where I get to at the end of my book. So you don't have to buy it anymore, to be honest.
Can I ask you a question off the back of that, Debra?
Yeah, sure.
So off the back of what Steve said, how is storytelling, or how can it be a type of resistance?
Absolutely. And I think... because I think one of the reasons myth works the way it does is that claiming of the identity. And I think the geographic isolation of Australia does not help that, particularly with another myth that Australia has not ever been an incredibly multicultural country. You know, we claim to be multicultural now, but we're certainly not multicultural. But I think that when you are in close proximity to them, that myth-making becomes pivotal to national identity in a way that we don't have to think about here in Australia. We can own that Anzac myth, and I have family who are Anzacs. We can own that myth without it being challenged in any way, shape or form, because those people are a long way across the ocean. So, you know, the idea then of storytelling, our geographic isolation and the lack of recognition of the genuinely deep multiculturalism and multilingualism that exists here is something that enables that flexibility, let's just say it because I'm an inherently kind person, around what our storytelling looks like. When we assume that it is this language that we are speaking, that is the thing that we are going to utilise. You know, even with every respect, and it's not a criticism, even the idea of the Bark Petitions not being books, and I know you haven't said that, Aboriginal art, why? It's not art, it's book. It's a book. Have a look at the rock carvings. They are books. You know, have a look at any other kind of Aboriginal art. It's only art because we don't want to put the effort and the energy into understanding that that is a different way of storytelling. It is not art. Not art. It is way more important. And when we tell this story around Aboriginal iconography being art, you know, and look, my daughter is an amazingly gorgeous artist, but she's very clear around the role of art as story, because that's what Gurindji mob do, that's what Wakaya mob do, that's what Yolngu mob do, that's what everybody does. It is not art. It's a convenient myth-telling.
In this book, you change the way the reader thinks about language. So after I read your book and I was speaking to Indigenous aunties and they were using English in their own way, I understood it completely differently. Yeah. So you've taken language and you're using it really to make change. And that's fascinating. You're retelling the story.
We have to. For the sake of our country, you know, we're all Australians together. I'm not advocating a kumbaya moment, but we're all Australians together. We do have to get over ourselves. Whether we want to talk about it being conquered or stolen is indulging that binary thinking.
Yep.
We are smart people. We are wise people, as Steve says. And I feel sorry for Steve up here with 3 women.
I'm
doing sorry,
great.
Steve.
I've got the best seat in the house.
You know, we have to get over ourselves. We have to actually admit to who we are. We are on stolen country. But if that's too hard, let's think about what that vocabulary needs to be. Let's create the story that we want in this country.
I just want to keep going, Claire, with this idea of resistance and storytelling, because it feels very much to me that this is a work of resistance as well, a work that you were asked to write. So talk to me about the way that, you know, these Bark Petitions, which, you know, have been in a dusty corner of Parliament House, you're actually telling a completely different story about them as diplomatic documents, documents of resistance, but documents of a strong people meeting a white government on the same level.
They're actually not in a dusty corner. They're actually, you can walk past them. They're in a very open and public place right where all the portraits are. So if you go and walk to where the portrait of Tony Abbott is and the Queen, and then you turn around.
Do we
there's
have
the
to
Bark
do that?
Petitions. I think it's somebody's idea of a joke, actually. And and so they are right there. They are central. My point there is that we haven't understood how to read this story. The people in Parliament in 1963, when they were put to the House of Representatives, they didn't know how to read the story. Yolngu could read the story. In fact, the term that the Yolngu use is the land grew a tongue, and Terraglossia. It says that on the front. So I think it is story, and perhaps this is the phrase that the Uluru Dialogues has used, which is, and the Uluru State from the Heart, the idea of truth telling. We can talk about that as storytelling, and then maybe a whole bunch of people won't feel as threatened by that idea if we talk about it as storytelling rather than truth telling. But what I think the stories do in all their many forms and all their many platforms and mediums, whether that is film, photography, music, and books and writing, is that what they start to do is to change that process that started with invasion. And I love that this is where your explanation of your title, because one of the things that I say in the epilogue of this book, which is actually a work of narrative non-fiction, and I only, as an historian, kind of appear in the introduction and the epilogue, but one of the things that I say is that once we understand that there were 60,000 years of governance principles here, of political structures, of legal structures, we can also understand that the concept of terra nullius, which was overturned in the Mabo decision, finally, that concept of it being an empty land did more than just that piece of work. It also implied a governance nullius and a legal nullius and a language nullius. And so it actually hollowed out the country of all of its contents. And so it is repopulating the container that is the continent with the contents that have always been there. And that will, I think, allow us, maybe, Steve, the materials to start to build the new myths, the new thing that will carry us, as Deb said, and as we know from the voice referendum, it went down, but there are 6.2 million people who said yes to walking together. And there will be more because they were the younger generations, because they tended to be newer migrants to this country who are not as wedded to the old myths and the way that they worked. And so I think that's the stories, Ginger, is what, in all their many forms, is what will start to give us the raw material for sculpting the new myth.
Steve, Australians seem more comfortable mythologising the past rather than confronting it. And I wonder what you think the consequences are of that, politically, personally, culturally.
One of the things about any sort of storytelling is to try and... There's two ways. A nation is more than just a construction, a rational construction. A nation, a community, consists of more than just a form of rational things like a taxation system and a legal system, financial system, a political system. That is the rational structure. But any community, the most ancient, the most recent, nations as the most complex, require, in order for it to be held together, is an emotional structure. All communities need to be held together emotionally. And the structures for doing that are rituals, symbols, mythic forms, all of those sorts of things that engage people. Every family has them: birthday parties, anniversaries, graduation ceremonies. Every family's got their own private language that they alone understand, shorthand terms that no one else, even their next door neighbours, wouldn't necessarily get. The jokes they bring out, the redocumented narratives that aren't quite true but get more untrue in every retelling, but somehow are incredibly meaningful. They're the emotional structures that hold together a community and particularly are required to hold together the most complex community of all, a nation. And so often what is forgotten when we discuss these things, we're good at setting out the rational framework for these things, but the power of stories is to bind people together emotionally. So if we're looking at ways we can bring new stories into existence, to elevate new communities, to celebrate diversity, things that aren't necessarily elevated at the moment, the most powerful tool, and probably the most required tool, is that of storytelling. So the question to me becomes, what are the most effective and powerful stories to encapsulate these messages that we need to share? What are they? Because myths have done one more thing. They become sacred stories. What are the most powerful stories that we can use to change the form slightly, take some history, take some ancient story? How can we put them in a narrative form so that they resonate with people most effectively? And we know this. Tom Keneally, for example, took a story that was history and unknown about a bloke called Oscar Schindler and wrote a book about it, put it into a narrative form. The movies put it into even more of a narrative form, and it's only through the power of the narrative form that story is now celebrated, and so it goes with myth and great stories.
But I would argue, and I'd love to put this to you, Debra, that it's not just about telling the story, it's actually about people listening. Because there's certain people that nobody's listening to and nobody's willing to listen to, and there's certain stories that they are willing to hear.
Absolutely. You know, we've heard a number of times we're on unceded country. So what are the myths that exist here? One of my past colleagues is a geographer, and he was really interested in what open stories were being told by a number of Aboriginal communities. He went around the coastline of Australia. He listened to some of the open stories being told by Aboriginal people. Between 13 and 15,000 years, those myths were reflecting big geographic events that had occurred. You know, there were tsunamis, there were glaciers, there were really big geographic events. And stories that were being told by Aboriginal communities in each of those locations were recounting all of those things. Now, within Aboriginal storying practice, there is a very clear need, responsibility, accountability for participating in those stories. And this is kind of becoming a little bit more of a personal crusade, because my country is being fracked. And I'm not saying this as a political comment. My country is being fracked. Wave at me, please, if you've had a drink of water today. Please, if you've had a drink of water or a cup of tea, well, you jolly well better remember what that tastes like, because your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, will not have that privilege, and I'll tell you why. Because there is a myth in this country that Aboriginal knowledges are not as valid as Western science. And we all better get over that thinking very quickly, because Aboriginal knowledge will tell you that all of the aqueducts across the driest continent in the world, are all connected. So while they are drilling and fracking 20 kilometres from my water source, 20 kilometres, it will impact your water. So don't be too complacent about not having to worry about what they're doing up there in the Northern Territory. Or, I really need gas to keep me warm. Go down to the op shop and buy some coats and recycle things. You know. Can't afford to ignore
we
it.
are going to go to your questions in just a second. I want to ask you all this last question. So if you could redesign the national story, the national thinking to include your work, what would it look like if we started creating a new narrative?
First, it would come ground up. It would not be put top down. It would come ground up. I would learn the lessons from the stories that we've got. I'd be talking to Wesley Enoch and Noel Pearson basically said two things with which I agree, and that is there are three big stories in Australia. There's the story of the First Nations people, there's the story of settlement, and there's the story of multiculturalism. We've got one kind of myth in place on that front, and we've got two more to go, and we've got infinitely more to go because we can accommodate an infinite number of stories. So I'd be focusing on the second and the third, to be honest.
Claire?
I guess I'm an historian, so I've got special pleading rights on this, but I would be encouraging a history also that comes from the ground up, and I think that's where our democracy does. These are handmade items that are the material heritage of our democracy, the flag, the banner and the bark, and I would be encouraging a joining of the dots between the various events in history. I mean, even just listening to Debra talk about the water supply, that was one of the main things that the Yolngu people were concerned about, was where the mining headquarters were going to be situated was 1.5 kilometres from the water supply. And that's where did all the massacres mostly happen. They were around places of water supply. That we have all been in this story together, and we will continue to be in this story together, and that if we can start joining the dots to history, we can also start, I don't believe in the we will never forget and won't make mistakes again, but we will be able to understand how people have worked together. I think the other thing that's part of this democracy trilogy is showing that action happens best when it happens collectively, that we don't have superheroes, that there's not one person who comes to save the day, that collective action is what brings about transformation and real change.
Debra?
Absolutely, the collective, we all need to be participating in the creating of our own stories and our own myths. We need to take ownership. We can't be passive, it's not how the world works. We have to participate in the life that we have been given to live, and it's up to us to make it matter or to be passive around letting somebody else push us along.
And if I can just ask you one final question, which is, how important is language in that story going forward?
Language is critically important because as the standard Australian English vocabulary is at the moment, it is very excluding of people who are not from that linguistic background. So, because if you think about it, your vocabulary, it expresses everything and all of who you are and what you might become. So the more we remain static within our vocabulary set, the more we remain committed to maintaining that, the longer we are going to have these really, really super hard and difficult conversations about how we genuinely become an amazing nation. I know that people somewhere in the world want to make America great again, but we have the capacity to do that genuinely here by giving back a little. All of us, just give back a little.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to go to your questions. We've got a few minutes left. Who's going to ask a question? And please start with who, what, why, when, where, how. Don't want long yarns. Can you give a microphone to Juno at the front? There's someone carrying a microphone around? Oh, we can give you one, guys.
Firstly, thank you so much for that brilliant panel, that brilliant discussion by all of you. And it seems to me that this discussion is really about what I would call the heart of the matter. It's the heart of the matter about where we are now. And in to just step back a bit, in the context of truth-telling, I think we have to throw out some myths that are, that we've all grown up with. Like, everybody in this room was taught an untruthful history, right? We were all lied to about what actually happened here. It was excluded from the myths of the time, which wanted to heroicise the murderers and the desperately sad notion and facts of how this nation was founded. Now, in this discussion here, I'm so glad, Steve, to see you take on Gallipoli, which has been, the giant unto which we've all been buried for so long. And like when I think of the national, the War Memorial Museum, and how long have we been fighting for the War Memorial to be inclusive, to include the frontier wars? So can we all make this a crusade? That, we have to really create these new myths, as you are all saying.
Have you got a question there, Juno?
Yes, I'm getting to it. The question is, where you've taken the idea of myth, the one thing you haven't addressed is that myths serve a purpose. Now, who designs that, and how can we design it for the myths of the future? That's my question.
Thanks, Juno.
Well, myths are the most ancient form of storytelling. If you buy this book, it's got all the elements in it. They're the most ancient form of storytelling, and they're about belonging, about who we are, where we belong, and what we do. That's the point of a myth. It conveys that. It's essentially the purpose of a myth is to say, how do we exist? Every nation has them. We can't prescribe them, we find them. We nurture them, we don't design them, we find them. And when we find them, we look after them, we fertilise them. Sorry, what was the specific question?
Just that they're like the Gallipoli myth is for a purpose. It's very patriarchal.
No, it's about belonging. It's literally every community needs to belong. That's all that myths do. It's a form of belonging, who we are, where we are, and what we do. They literally arise out of events in history.
Okay, who would like to go next?
Just a quick question. It will start with a little statement, which is just in relation to silencing large portions of a community. And one of the things that makes a better community is having other voices. And I think that that's something that in Australia we're losing a lot of the time. So I just wanted to put that over to the panel. How do we improve our ability to not silence?
Debra?
Absolutely, I think it's listening, but it's the words. My language has 4 genders, so in my community there is no need for people who are not binary to claim and identify their space. They already exist. It's the words. We have to critique the vocabulary.
Just got one more up the back.
Take the other question.
Thank you.
If we go... Sorry, it's from here.
Thank you. My question really is about historical amnesia and context. And my experience, I guess, is that people often trivialise history by referring to context and normalising that. So how do you overcome that? What tips would you give?
This is one of the things that Janet Albrechtsen actually threw at me in her column on Wednesday, and as did the editorial that appeared in The Australian last weekend on the back of the comments that I made at Sydney Writers' Festival. And what they accused me of is holding people in the past to the standards of today, and essentially saying that people in the past, they were just acting on the interests in the context that they were, and that us woke people up here on stages at writers' festivals have unrealistic expectations of the past, and we are trying to put our own personal, ideological, political agendas of today onto the past. Now, I think that's nonsense. And I think that it adds to the silencing that you're talking about. You don't have to blame certain people, although I'm sure Deborah would be very, I won't speak for you, but, you know, in terms of Steve, not Steve, that's you, in terms of David Marr talking about his ancestors.
He was very good.
You know, but you don't need to you don't necessarily need to let those ancestors off the hook for the things that they did, because they were doing them within a context of colonisation. I mean, we do have the ability to critique colonisation. We have the ability to critique military narratives, I think is what you're getting at, Juno. And we should be doing that. And when we are bullied into silences in the way that the Australians campaign appears to be trying to bully people who want to suggest that there are other narratives that we could be telling, that's when we have to just continue to stand up and tell the stories and resist, particularly when they are evidence-based stories, as all of ours are. Steve's is a very scholarly book. He gave us a rap before, and I'll give you a rap too. I have an endorsement in Steve's book. These are all works of scholarship. So actually, if you're going to dismiss the narratives, you're also dismissing the whole concept of scholarship, and then we're into climate denial and flat earthing, and I don't think we want to go there.
I'm sorry, Steve. Really, really quickly, Aboriginal people are storytellers. I know what my grandmother felt running away from the massacre. I know what my grandmother felt being raped by 6 non-Aboriginal men to teach her a lesson. So the part of the importance about the silencing is understanding that there is that other story there.
Thank you, Deborah. That goes back to what we were talking about, where as a nation we can't really know ourselves unless we know our past. Thank you so much to Steve Vizard, Debra Dank and Clare Wright, and thank you to you all for coming.